Hey guys, Mark here. How you doing? I have just spent the last give or take 9 hours trying to be able to record lectures and videos like this, and it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but at least right now it is usable. So I am way behind everything today. The IT guys were here for hours and hours and hours, and we managed to at least get it operational. So. Um, the lecture today will be one of the speakers we've had in the past. So sit back and enjoy. Love to know what you think in the Q&A after. Take care.
Our first speaker is a longtime member of our community, and I'll throw an upstanding member of our community, even though his wife may disagree. For those of you who don't know his wife, her name is Lisa Lake. She works in the School of Business and Economics with us. And I told Lisa that I was going to invite Terry to speak, and she was quite pleased because, one, it gets him out of her hair, because Terry's in transition. How are those hormone treatments going? Okay. That's what she said. He's in transition, but he's not in transition, that kind of transition. He's in work transition. So Terry Lake has been a professor here in the School of Veterinary Medicine at TRU, and he's been the mayor of Kamloops and a cabinet minister in the provincial government. His last post was the Minister of Health. And then from there, he went on to my old stomping grounds in Ottawa to work with one of Canada's leading cannabis companies. And although I wanted him to talk about taking care of your diabetic cat today, he convinced me talking about cannabis would be more interesting for you guys. So, that said, Dr. Terry Lake.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm also teaching a business ethics course in the School of Business and Economics, and it's really great to be in front of students again. I have missed being at TRU and missed being in Kamloops for the last couple of years. So I've been back for about 6 months now, and it's great to be back at TRU. When I first started teaching here in 1997, it was University College of the Caribou, and it was a much smaller campus. This building wasn't here. Through the last 20 years, this university has grown substantially, obviously, and the greatest growth has been in the international program. And a lot of international students, of course, are in the School of Business and Economics. So I want to say welcome to all of the students that have come to Kamloops from other countries. Our community is better because you're here, and our university is better because you're here. And I think for our students, our Canadian students, working with international students is a great benefit to your careers as well. So, cannabis in Canada. As you probably are aware, Canada is actually one of 2 countries in the world that has legalized cannabis for recreational purposes. So, Uruguay is the other one. And even though there are some states in the United States that have legalized cannabis, it is still illegal at the federal level in the United States. So, first thing I want to tell everyone is, even though it's legal here and legal in Washington State, do not take cannabis across the border to the United States, because it is illegal federally, and the border, of course, is run by the federal government in the United States, and you'll have a problem if you try to take cannabis into the United States. So a lot of people don't remember or know that cannabis used to be legal. Before 1923, cannabis was used in Canada and in much of the Western world, and often was called hemp oil, and was used for various ailments, stomach problems, all kinds of different ailments as a pain reliever. And it really, was marketed in medications that were commonly used by people every day. It was prohibited in Canada in 1923. And this was, sort of happening all across the Western world as, it was associated with certain ethnic groups that the governments, particularly of the United States, were sort of subtly trying to suppress, and were directing policies at ethnic groups that they, in their eyes, were using cannabis for recreational purposes rather than medical purposes. So in 1923, with very little parliamentary debate in Canada, cannabis, or marijuana, as it was most often called, was prohibited in 1923. But of course, you know, through the 50s into the 60s and the 70s, the use of marijuana in Canada was very common. Lots of young people in high school and in universities used marijuana. Lots of people got sent to jail for using marijuana, for selling marijuana. And the government in 1972, Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, put together a commission called the Ledane Commission to look at all kinds of drug use, because in the 70s there was real concern about the amount of drug use and, you know, how to manage it. And the commission actually recommended decriminalizing the use of marijuana in 1972, not to legalize it, but to say that if you were caught using it, you wouldn't go to jail. Going to jail is one of the most unhealthy things that can ever happen to you because, number one, you have difficulty getting a job afterwards, and if you can't get a job, you're not likely to have a very successful life. And, you know, it's not an environment that's really conducive to a healthy lifestyle anyway. And getting sent to jail for the use of a substance that is less harmful than alcohol, tobacco, and almost anything else that, you know, we consume, really had put a lot of people in a bad situation. So decriminalizing was a very good recommendation. But the political will of the time wasn't there to do that. So it remained criminalized. And then in 2000, the court said, you know, this is a substance that helps people. It helps people with pain, different medical conditions. People were using it. And when they were being sent to jail for using something that helped them with their physical pain, the court said that's unconstitutional. You have to make a system that allows people to use cannabis for medical purposes. So in 2001, the then Liberal government allowed limited access for medical purposes, and that over the next decade or so was changed again by court decisions. And in 2013, new regulations were put in place by the Conservative government of the day, creating licensed producers. These were companies like the company that I worked for that were licensed to produce and sell medical cannabis only, not recreational cannabis. So what someone would have to do is they'd get an authorization from their physician. They would then register with a licensed producer, and they would put in their order and get their cannabis delivered to them. But of course, in the background, there were all kinds of licensed dispensaries, or not licensed dispensaries, sorry, cannabis dispensaries that were illegal in all kinds of places. In Vancouver, of course, there were more pot shops than liquor stores. And the local governments kind of tolerated them. The police didn't shut them down. And so the Liberal government in 2015 said, you know what, we're going to legalize cannabis. We're going to make it legal for Canadians of a certain age to be able to access cannabis for both medical and recreational purposes. And that act, the Cannabis Act, came into force in 2018. Now, why legalize cannabis, first of all? Well, Canadians are among the highest consumers of cannabis. You can see 21% of those 15 to 19 years of age use cannabis on a regular basis, 30% of those 20 to 24. So lots of people were using it, even when it was illegal. Lots of Canadians were using cannabis. And yet, in 2015, half of all drug charges involved cannabis. So 50,000 people were being charged with cannabis possession. And, you know, I talked about the public harms of having a criminal record. Organized crime, of course, was very involved in cannabis, marijuana production and sales. Most of the dispensaries in Vancouver were supplied by organized crime. And there was, of course, a lack of quality control. There was mold, heavy metals, pesticides. No one really knew what was in that cannabis that were being purchased at illegal dispensaries. So the goals of legalizing cannabis were twofold. One, to protect young people. In other words, if you have a proper age-gated system, like liquor, then people that were younger than the age of access would have a harder time getting hold of the substance. And number two, you would eliminate the criminal element, and you would bring something from the black market into the white or licit market, the legal market. And that way, you'd have proper quality control, you would have tax that would go to the government and support universities, healthcare, and you'd create a lot of legitimate jobs for people across the country. So those were the goals of legalization. We can talk later about whether those have been achieved or not. Spoiler alert, the answer is no. And there was lots of support for legalization of cannabis. So in a survey in 2016, 43% said they support it, 26% somewhat support. So, compared to those that were against legalization, it was pretty well accepted that it was the right thing to do. And whenever the public is in favor of something, it makes government action on that a lot easier than if they're opposed to it, obviously. Okay, so how big is the cannabis market? And first of all, again, it shows you, what percentage of people in Canada are using cannabis on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, that by this year, they expect that the cannabis market will be higher than liquor, not beer or wine, but hard liquor, and just behind wine consumption sales. Beer, of course, and tobacco are still pretty high. So, that's a lot of sales of cannabis. So this is a big business in Canada, and one that still has a lot of development to go and has some really great opportunities for you in business. So again, 2015, Justin Trudeau said that they would legalize cannabis, but before they did that, they put a task force together. And the task force toured around the country, talked to all kinds of different stakeholder groups, and the goal was that in taking a public health approach to the regulation of cannabis, the task force proposes that measures will maintain and improve the health of Canadians by minimizing the harms associated with cannabis use. So the government isn't saying go out there and use cannabis. They're saying, we know you're going to use cannabis, so let's use it in a responsible, healthy, educated way. So the minimum age across the country would be 18, but each province or territory could put in their own age. And most provinces went with the same age as access to alcohol. So in British Columbia, the age of access for cannabis is 19. In Quebec, you can access alcohol when you're 18, and initially, under the Liberal government there, the Liberal provincial government, the cannabis access was 18 as well. The government there now is the CAQ, which is a Conservative government, and they have raised the age of access to 21. So what has that done? Well, all it's done is say to 18 to 21-year-olds, if you want cannabis, you got to get it from the organized crime section of society. And you don't have any quality control on the cannabis. So they claim it's a public health measure, but it's exactly the opposite. It's going against a public health model. In fact, all the public health officers in Quebec were opposed to raising that age to 21. There's strict advertising restrictions and promotion, more like tobacco, for instance, than liquor. So you see liquor advertised all the time. You have happy hours, you can go to a bar and consume liquor. With cannabis, where companies are not allowed to advertise, except in very restricted environments where they're sure that people are over the age of access. And they can't associate tobacco or cannabis use with any kind of lifestyle. So you can't say, if you want to be, have a pleasant, contemplative experience, use our, so-and-so type of cannabis. You really, all you can say is, this is our cannabis, this is the amount of THC and CBD in it, and, warning messages basically telling you that it's really bad stuff. So it's not exactly the best way to support an industry if you can't talk about your product very much, and if the packaging is such that you can't differentiate your product from your competitor's product. So it's kind of like setting up a new industry and then tying one hand behind their back. I would argue, and many in the industry argue, that you can still protect the health of Canadians. You can still produce and consume cannabis in a responsible way without these kind of restrictive laws regarding promotion and packaging. So, oh, great. Thanks, Max. So October 17th, 2018 was when cannabis for recreational use became legal in Canada. And they didn't legalize all kinds of cannabis right away. It was restricted to oils and a maximum concentration of 10 milligrams per mil of THC. And just for those of you who are unfamiliar, used to be in university, you knew everyone was familiar with cannabis, but maybe not today. THC is tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the component of THC that gets you high, right? So it's intoxicating. CBD, or cannabidiol, is the part of cannabis that does not cause intoxication, but it still has an effect on your brain and your immune system and some regulatory components of your physiology. So people use THC to get that euphoric feeling. They use CBD sometimes to offset some of the anxiety-provoking aspects of THC. I use CBD every day without THC, so I use CBD every day, twice a day, and I use it to regulate my sleep, to help my mood, and it is an anti-inflammatory, and when you get to be my age and you still like to, run and do things like that, it kind of reduces a lot of that joint pain and symptoms of inflammation. So THC and CBD. The oils, 10 milligrams per mil, were allowed. No edibles were allowed, except there were some powders that were in the medical market that were allowed to continue to be made. No concentrated forms of THC. Very strict packaging provisions and very strict marketing and promotion provisions. And then each province or territory could create their own distribution and retailing systems. So in BC, for instance, they decided to go with a provincial distributor, much like the liquor distribution branch. So all cannabis had to be sold into the cannabis branch of the provincial government, and then it would go out to the stores. And in BC, it's a mixed model of government and private stores. So Kamloops by the Save On Foods, that was the first government cannabis store in British Columbia. Well, now we have, I think, 3 government stores and about 5 or 6 private stores as well. In Alberta, they left everything up to all the retailing to the private sector. In Saskatchewan, they left all the distributing and retailing to the private sector. So it's a different model wherever you go. In Quebec, it's all distribution and all retailing by the government. Okay, just this past October, the second tranche of legalization occurred where edibles and drinks were allowed to be sold. So you could only have a maximum of 10 milligrams of THC per package or container. So if you buy a beverage, when those become available, I think some are available now, you can only get 10 milligrams in a bottle or a can of cannabis beverage. And if you're buying, gummies or cookies, they can only have 10 milligrams per package. So you might get 5 2-milligram cookies. Some of you, 2 milligrams might be enough to get a nice buzz. Some of you, 5 cookies might be needed. If you go down to Washington State, it's quite different. They have 10 milligram maximum dose per cookie, but you can get 10 cookies in a package, so you've got 100 milligrams in one package. When I was down there last Easter, we were down there for Thanksgiving because my in-laws live down there, and so I have 3 grown daughters. They were there, and some of their partners were there. We all had Thanksgiving dinner. We went out that afternoon and all met up at the local brewery, had a couple of beers, played cards in the courtyard. It was very nice. But my youngest daughter, who's 25, had gone into the cannabis store next door and bought a cannabis drink. And it was 75 milligrams. And I said, oh, that's a lot. And I said, you got to be careful with that. So when we got home and, we had a glass of wine before dinner, then we had, well, as we were getting ready for dinner, I said, well, why don't we take out that cannabis drink and give it a try? So there were, I think, 7 of us that shared this drink. So we each got about 10 milligrams. We had dinner, and halfway through dinner, all of a sudden I realized I was completely stoned. And for those of you who know that feeling, you get a little paranoid. You think, does everyone know that I'm stoned? Like, am I eating my meal properly? And afterwards, when my mother-in-law asked me to cut up the rest of the turkey, I was really concerned I was going to cut off one of my thumbs. So I was very careful about the way I cut the turkey. Anyway, I decided that I better go lay down because I was a little embarrassed that I felt this much from that one drink. And then I found out the next day that all the kids and their partners that we all shared had the same feeling. They stayed up all night, had a great time playing cards, finished up all of the leftovers from supper, and had a really nice evening, and I missed it all. So all of that to say that it doesn't take much in a drink or an edible to get quite high, because it has a different effect on you than inhaling a smoked form of cannabis. Couple of reasons why. Number one, it's not absorbed right away, and so there's a tendency, because you're not feeling it, there's a tendency to say, oh, I need some more. And then by the time it is affecting you, you've had too much. But also, it's absorbed into your bloodstream and goes into the liver when it goes into your digestive system. And so the liver transforms it into other chemicals that have a different impact on your brain than if you're smoking it. It goes directly across the lungs, into your bloodstream and into your brain. So that's why Health Canada has said, we're going to limit the amount to 10 milligrams. We want people to kind of get used to this product before we have all of these strange effects and people, getting freaked out by having too much. I'm sure many of you have stories of overindulging in cannabis. Like the cops in Toronto that busted an illegal cannabis store, ate some of the product, and one of them ended up in a tree. Don't ask me why, but obviously ate a few too many brownies. So again, the concentrates, the concentrated form that you can vaporize, they could only be 1,000 milligrams of THC per package. Not allowed to add sugars, colors, nicotine, or caffeine. They shouldn't be appealing to kids and shouldn't make any health claims. So this is what a package looks like. You have to have the big THC symbol there, basically saying, hey, this is something you should think about before you consume. It has to have the amount of THC and CBD listed. All these warnings have to be on there in both French and English, and then the product information as well. So that doesn't leave a lot of space for any kind of promotion. And all you can do is put your brand name and your logo, and that's it. So it's not like going into a liquor store and seeing all the different kinds of wine labels and beer labels. You go into a cannabis store, and this is what you see. It all looks pretty well the same in terms of the product. So for companies that produce cannabis, it's very difficult to differentiate one from another. But the stores look pretty nice. Any of you have been to the one here in town? They are very nice looking stores, kind of a cross between a dispensary and an Apple store. Okay, let's see what effect legalization of cannabis has had on the use of cannabis in Canada. Well, this was just before legalization. So you can see that across Canada, about 15.2% of Canadians had used cannabis in the previous 3 months. And you can see some provinces, cannabis is much more popular than others. Nova Scotia, 23%. British Columbia, 20%. So this was when cannabis was still illegal, except for medical purposes. And then 1 year later, so before really we've had edibles, just the limited array of products we had in the first year, you can see that now the scale is a little different. So even though these bars look lower, they're actually higher. So if we had 15.2% of Canadians using cannabis in the past 3 quarters a year ago, now it's up to 17.1%. If you look at Nova Scotia, it went from 23% to 32%. BC, 20% to 20.4%. So, British Columbians were using a lot anyway. It didn't really make much difference. Alberta was 17, now it's 18.8. So not a huge increase in cannabis use. So critics of legalization would say, oh, you're going to get all Canadians using cannabis, and this is going to, another harmful substance out there. The data shows that it really hasn't increased cannabis use much in that 1 year. But what it's done is shifted cannabis from the black market into the legitimate legal market. Not completely, of course. There's still, particularly in provinces like BC, there is still a huge black market supply of cannabis. If you look at retail sales by cannabis stores from October 2018 to September 2019, again, this only shows Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the rest of Canada. You can see that, it's gone up significantly in terms of retail sales. This is legal cannabis. So it hasn't gone up, in an exponential way. It's a steady growth. And then once, of course, the edibles came on later in 2019, we expect this to go up a little higher. If you look at different provinces and say, okay, how are different provinces doing in terms of retail sales? So again, this is just legal sales. In all of Canada, $907 million of sales at cannabis stores, which on average is $24 per person. But you can see the difference. If you go down to Alberta, $195 million and $45 per person. Compare that to British Columbia, only $49 million, only $10 a person. It shows you the difference between Alberta's system of private stores, and they opened up hundreds of stores across Alberta, versus the very restrictive and slow way that British Columbia has rolled out cannabis distribution and retailing, only $10 per person in British Columbia. And yet we know that on average more British Columbians use cannabis than Albertans. So the government in BC has done what some would say a very poor job of rolling out cannabis legalization. I have a couple of friends here in Kamloops who had a store lease. They had approval from the city. They waited over a year to get their approval from the province. So they are paying a lease, yet not bringing in any money because they didn't get their approval from the province. So in BC, what this means is that the black market is still very much lucrative and doing well in BC versus the legal market. With time, of course, this will change. Washington State had this similar problem when they first legalized, and they readjusted some of the taxing and some of the rules around it, and then they saw a shift away from the black market. So in Washington State at the moment, only about 20 to 23% of cannabis is obtained through the black market. The rest comes from legitimate retail cannabis stores. And the amount of revenue that the state of Washington makes from cannabis is over $300 million a year, which is greater than the money they make from alcohol sales. So we're missing an opportunity here in British Columbia, and hopefully that will improve. Okay, I just want to give you an example of Hexo, the company I work for, as just kind of an example of a company in the emerging cannabis industry. It began in 2015 as a medical marijuana company, so had very small growing area, about 7,000-foot greenhouse in Gatineau, Quebec, just across the river from Ottawa. It had patients across Canada, but only about 2,000 to 3,000, so it's not a huge business. But they were anticipating legalization, and so went out and raised a lot of capital for expansion. There were about 50 employees in 2016. When I joined in September of 2017, there were about 70 or 80 employees. It went up to 1,100 in less than 2 years. Now, because of the slow rollout of cannabis at the retail sector, many companies have had to scale back because the revenue just hasn't been coming in as quickly as they anticipated. So now Hexo is down to 900 employees today. And if you look at the stock price of these cannabis companies, excuse me, you'll see that they peaked just before legalization, or just before legalization. They were at about the highest. They had about another peak about 6 months later, and then they've gone drastically down. So Hexo stock, for instance, when I joined the company, was $1.37. It went up to $11.50 at one point, and now is down around $2. So that's the rationalization of an industry. And if you follow stock markets at all, you know that the value of the shares is based on sort of emotion a lot of time and anticipated growth. And a lot of Canadians were jumping into the cannabis market, just like they jumped into, the dot-com boom in the 90s. And so companies weren't really having to make money to demonstrate their value. They just had to show promise. So the cannabis stocks went way up. A lot of people made a lot of money. And then once legalization happened and that revenue didn't come in as quickly as they hoped because of the poor rollout of retail, the stocks, the disappointment occurs, everyone jumps off the bandwagon, and the stocks come down. I mean, this is an industry that's going to be here for a long time, and it will improve, and those stocks will improve as well. But you can imagine that it's made borrowing money for these companies very difficult now because their share price and their total value has come down quite a bit. When I started there, they just finished a new greenhouse, brought it up to about 50,000 square feet, and now they have 1.8 million square feet of greenhouse space. And I'll show you a bit of a video of one of these greenhouses to give you an idea what it looks like. So here's an ETF. An ETF is a fund that has a bunch of different companies in a different sector, and this is the best way to invest if you rather than trying to pick out stocks. If you like a certain industry, you like a certain part of the economy, to buy an ETF is often what's recommended. And you can see that 2018, that peak, one peak where legalization occurred, and then a little bit of a peak at the end of the year. Crashed in December, as the whole stock market did in December of 2018, and then regained some into the spring, and now you can see where that ETF fund now is at $8.52, and it was at $25 at one time. So again, this is Hexo, where they had 310,000 square feet. With the first expansion, added another 1 million square feet, to produce about 108 tons of cannabis a year. So that's a lot of cannabis. And then they went and bought another company and added more greenhouse space to bring them up to 1.8 million square feet. So this was the first expansion. This is 250,000 square feet of greenhouse. These greenhouses are, this one is made by a Dutch company, and they are very automated. I'll show you in a second some of the features of these. Just at the top of the picture, you can see some dirt there. That's where the new 1 million square foot greenhouse is now complete, and I'll show you the inside of that. Also, they bought a warehouse in Ontario, and this, at the time, this was the old Sears distribution center, 2 million square foot building. That was the largest warehouse in North America when it was built in the late 1980s. And it was empty because Sears has basically gone out of business. And so this was sitting empty. So Hexo, through a joint venture company, bought the building and uses 580,000 square feet. And this is where they make their gummies and chocolates and cookies, and where the beverages will go. Hexo teamed up with Molson Coors. They make, obviously, beer and different alcoholic drinks. So they formed a joint venture. So two companies come together to form a partnership, and this partnership is called Truss, and Truss is the company making these cannabis beverages from that facility in Ontario. And the whole idea behind Hexo was kind of like Intel, the chip Intel, and you look at computers and you'd see a label saying Intel inside. And so the whole premise of Hexo was to partner with Fortune 500 companies like Molson Coors in beverages and use that sort of powered by Hexo concept, so that each of the products would be made potentially by a joint venture company with a Fortune 500 partner, and then the active ingredient, of course, the cannabis, would come from the Hexo Corporation. So this is the model that they worked with. I don't know if they've changed. I haven't been with the company for 6 months now, so they may have looked at this and said, okay, given the market, given the state of play in the industry, we may need to change this. But it's a very interesting hub and spoke model of corporate structure that creates these independent companies that produce these different products powered by the ingredient produced by one of the joint ventures. They also created another joint venture with a company in Greece and are building a 250,000 square foot greenhouse in Greece for the European medical cannabis market, which potentially could be quite large. My job was Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility, and that's what I'm teaching here at TRU. And so we developed a Corporate Social Responsibility Charter. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with CSR, it is a way of making sure companies examine not just the profit that their company makes. Anyone familiar with Milton Friedman? Famous economist, you should get to know that name, Milton Friedman. He said, the only stakeholder that matters is the shareholder. That's all that matters. You just need to make money, and then everything will look after itself. And that was kind of the theme of Wall Street, you know, in the 1980s movie, Greed is Good. If you read any Ayn Rand, that's sort of the sort of philosophy that companies should only worry about making money. It's not up to them to satisfy all these different stakeholders. That thinking has changed a lot. So companies now put together programs to look after environmental aspects of their operations, look after social aspects, look after education, make sure they have good governance, making sure they're looking after their employees. And that way, if you increase your level of responsibility voluntarily, then governments are less likely to come and enforce regulations upon you. So, and also now there's a lot of financial companies that won't invest in companies unless they are doing good corporate social responsibility. So what is the fund just the other day? BlackRock is the largest investment fund in the world. They control $7 trillion. They're the largest shareholder in Suncor, Canada's largest oil industry. They own $20 billion of ExxonMobil in the United States. And they basically have said, everyone needs to pay attention to corporate social responsibility, and they are divesting themselves out of those companies that are, you know, fossil fuel companies, for instance. So they will decrease their investment in Suncor and ExxonMobil, and they are going to invest in companies that have good corporate social responsibility. So we designed one that was centered around four aspects, 4 Ps, if you like. And the first was people. So the people in our community, our employees, nonprofits like the health foundations that were helping people in our area, and also training people to work in the cannabis industry. The second was focused on public. Of course, we have medical patients across Canada that we were still serving, that we were providing material to retailers so people understood the proper and responsible use of our products. We had online and telephone support so people could find out how to use our products. And then we did knowledge transfer with organizations like the Gastrointestinal Society about how cannabis can help people with Crohn's disease and colitis and other inflammatory bowel diseases. The third 3 was products. We provided naturally grown and rigorously tested medical cannabis of uncompromising quality. We emphasize smoke-free options because, you know, smoking anything is not good for you. So that's why we developed some of our oil sprays and now the beverages and other products that you don't have to smoke. And then a very important one, the planet. Minimizing our electricity consumption by utilizing greenhouses versus growing indoors and having to power all those lights. We have recycling programs. We monitored our carbon footprint, so we measured all the greenhouse gases we were using and had a plan in place to reduce them. And we supported organizations like the Ottawa Riverkeeper, which is an environmental organization dedicated to the health of the Ottawa River Valley. And you know, having a good corporate social responsibility program and having a proper engagement with your stakeholders doesn't mean you don't run into problems. And so some of the problems that people that are producing cannabis have are odor. Even though, you know, if you walk into a cannabis cultivation facility, you'll smell cannabis. Just like when you walk into a pine forest or forest of fir trees, you smell those trees. These are terpenes. These are volatile fatty acids that come off of plants. And cannabis has distinct terpenes that give it that odor before it's burned. The burning of cannabis provides, you know, a different kind of odor, but just growing it, you will smell those terpenes. And the different strains of cannabis have different kind of smells. But some people don't like that smell. And so, you know, there are regulations being proposed in some areas of the country to control the odors. And yet, it's a farm operation. And if you're next to a dairy farm, the government doesn't come along and say, hey, that smells like a dairy farm. You know, it's an agricultural operation, and people expect there will be some odor there. But it may cause some companies to have to limit the size of the operation or to put expensive equipment to control odors. They may limit distance to other businesses or homes. And we saw that some concern here. There's an operation going into West Side in Kamloops, and already the neighbors are concerned about the impact it will have on their lifestyle. The Agricultural Land Reserve in British Columbia, again, it says that this is an agricultural use, so it cannot be, you can't outlaw the growing of cannabis on the Agricultural Land Reserve, so that's a positive thing for the industry. But local governments can ban retail sales of cannabis. They can come in and put restrictions on where cannabis production goes if it's not on the Agricultural Land Reserve land. And that, again, has some restrictions in some parts of British Columbia. So cities like Richmond said, we are not going to have any cannabis retail stores in Richmond. So what are people in Richmond going to do? Buy it in Vancouver, right? So, I mean, it's not like it's going to stop people buying it, those who want to buy it. It just means it's not available in their neighborhoods. I think you'll see that change with time. Now, hopefully this will come up. This is a video of the inside of our 1 million square foot facility. That's the outside there. This was when it was just finishing construction. Greenhouse, water holding tank there, and water is recycled. Here you can see the cannabis plants on the floor. When they start out, the floors are flooded. When they get to be a little older, the plants are then taken out of this area and put into separate pots and put on tables where the light can be controlled. The amount of carbon dioxide fed into the greenhouse can be controlled because plants use carbon dioxide. The more you give them, the better they grow. You can see that each individual pot has a little tube going in, and that gives the water and the nutrients, again, based on a computerized system. You can see the little rail system here, so trolleys, motorized trolleys, computerized and remote control trolleys go up and down these aisles, so that minimizes the number of people that you need to have working in this facility. The airflow is maintained by those fans. You can see the white tube that is going along over top of the plants. That's full of warm water. So on cold days, you can lower that and provide heat to the plants. The floors are all heated, by the way. The roof can be shaded or opened to reduce the amount of sunlight or increase the amount of sunlight, because plants at different stages need different length of days. When they are young plants, they get 18 hours of sunlight a day, provided by natural sun and those lights, and 8 hours of darkness. And that forces them to grow a lot of leaves. And they grow a lot of size, and then after about 6 weeks, they're put into a 12-hour cycle. And what that does is it tells the plants, or makes the plant think that fall is coming. You know, when the days get shorter in the fall, that all the plants react to that. And so cannabis plants will start producing flowers because they're saying, whoop, it's time to reproduce. We better produce some flowers. And of course, these are all female plants. There's no male plants here, so they don't produce any seeds. There's no pollination occurring, but they produce really nice flowers. They're forced by that change of daylight to produce flowers, and of course the flower is where the active ingredients of cannabis reside, not in the leaves. So you can see it's a very modern, motorized, computerized facility. The water that flows out of the bottom of those containers will be captured in the trays and recycled and reused so that you're not using too much water. Again, all of the lighting is computerized, and we are looking at different ways, or the company is looking at different ways of further reducing greenhouse gases from their operations. So hopefully, I don't know how we're doing for time here, Mark. Well, that's about what I thought. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them for you, but hopefully that gives you a good overview of cannabis, the way it's produced, the way it's sold, and be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks.
So, Terry, this week, the news announced in Canada that 52% of women have purchased legal cannabis and 38% of men. From the data that you've seen in places like Washington State that have a much larger proportion, where do you anticipate that could go in Canada in terms of the legal versus legal?
That's a good question. There is definitely a gender difference in cannabis use. Men generally use more cannabis than women, and are heavier users of cannabis than women. And I'm not talking about the medical market, I'm talking about the recreational market. So what we're seeing by that statistic is that women are more likely to follow the rules. They're more likely to get it from a legal source, whereas men in BC are probably, by and large, still getting it from the black market. But I think over time, these things will balance out. It's going to take 5-6 years for this market to kind of stabilize, for the industry to be fully mature, and for those kind of figures to make sense to us. Yes?
So aside from the current restrictive regulations and kind of a bit of social bias that's going on, what do you think the likelihood is of cannabis becoming commodified?
Good question, and I think it certainly will. No one is going to be growing cannabis in 1.8 million square foot of greenhouse at some point. It'll either be grown outdoors in Colombia or India, or somewhere where it can grow easily outdoors and cheaper outdoors, and it will be shipped as an active pharmaceutical ingredient, an API, to places like Canada where it will be processed into different products. So I think that's the future, and even further down, you'll probably get cannabis, the components of cannabis being produced by bacteria or algae. Genetically modified E. coli can produce those ingredients. I mean, that's a bit down the road, but I imagine that's where we'll get. There'll still probably be a market for, grown cannabis like this, much like the craft beer market. So we'll see this sector really start to stratify with time. But CBD, which is more of a wellness product than a recreational product, I can see that CBD will be manufactured genetically, and it'll be in just about everything, sold for wellness. I mean, already you're seeing the hype about CBD, particularly in the United States, where it is legalized in many states, and it's appearing in everything. You can get pillows with CBD infused in it. I mean, it's getting a bit ridiculous. But so, yeah, we will see the commodification of cannabis in different forms. Max. Yeah, so you can buy seeds through some retailers. I'm not sure in British Columbia if you can buy the seeds through the provincial retailer or not. I honestly don't know. And again, it varies by province. Most provinces are allowing up to 4 plants. Quebec said no plants, and I think they've changed their mind on that again. And some people said, well, you know, if you allow people to grow their own, you're going to have all these mini grow-ops everywhere in everyone's home, and that, you know, can cause an issue if you're renting and the landlord is worried about mold and, you know, issues around having big plants in your home. But it's like everything else. You can grow your own tomatoes, but not too many people grow their own tomatoes to eat them. They usually go to the supermarket to get them. So it will be, I think, a small portion of the market, but certainly a lot of medical patients that are very familiar with cannabis and cannabis cultivation do grow their own. No canna-curious people here? Dare I ask everyone who uses cannabis to put up their hand? Is that a okay question? There we go. See, yeah. All right. Good for you. How many use alcohol? Interesting statistically, if you look at the states like Colorado, Washington, California, where they've had legalization for some time, particularly Colorado, Oregon, Washington State, the alcohol use has gone down as cannabis use has come up a little bit. So there is a bit of a substitution effect. And alcohol is, by any measure, way more harmful to you than cannabis. That's just a fact, a public health fact. So the substitution of alcohol with cannabis, I think, is a good public health outcome. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thank you very much, Terry. Please give him a big round of applause.